Well, again, Africa's debt profile, which has been a source of concern for many African countries, is one of the main things we've been looking at the square. Well, keep in mind that some analysts have come to say it is not enough to talk about the debt, incurred by African countries. What's really important is to see how much of such effort is put into, channeling that money into what it was actually meant for. And that is why on the square today, we have a continuation of our conversation looking at Africa's debt profile. Welcome, I'm Sulaiman. Well, the COVID-19 pandemic further dipped African countries into a debt crisis, while the rest of the world borrowed at low interest rates to offset the shocks from the public health emergency. African countries got loans at high interest rates. Now, the cost of debt servicing to African countries is outrageous. It takes up enormous parts of their budgets and further opens them up into more debts. Now, with prices of natural resources dwindling at international markets, African countries had far less to spend on projects. Now, Zambia is an example. It became the first African country to default on its debt in 2020, with its current debt at 120% of GDP. Now, the debt-to-GDP ratio of many African countries has risen as a result of the pandemic. And of course, recovery is also being affected by the slow recovery of prices of resources. Now, joining me today on the square to look at this are two great Africans. Trevor Hambai, he's a financial analyst and senior partner with Development Finance Associates in Zambia. And of course, Chibamba Kanyama, former IMF Communications Advisor in Zambia. Well, gentlemen, good to have both of you with us here on VSA. Now, quickly, let's start with you, Trevor. What can you tell us about Zambia's current debt burden?
Well, the first thing to appreciate about Zambia's debt position is that the country has got $12.7 billion in external debt. And yes, we also have a debt position which is more than 100% of GDP. But what is important regarding Zambia's debt position is that the debt is in three components, and that is what makes the difference. That we have got the first component, which is really speaking to bilateral loans, which is from multilateral lenders. This is only $2.1 billion. Then we have got the Euro bonds, which is another $3 billion. This is commercial debt that we have acquired from the capital market. And then the third component is the Chinese debt. This is the one that has come into play of recent times under the Chinese external program. And that debt is $6.7 billion. And those are the key considerations that we must have for Zambia's debt. But you must appreciate that Zambia has defaulted on its debt repayment.
Well, we seem to be having a glitch to that connection to Trevor. Let me see if we can bring on Chibamba here quickly. And if you're there, Chibamba, again, thanks for joining us. Historically, there is a lot of links with the copper riches of Zambia as a country. Now, is the country over-dependent on it at the moment?
I hope I get your question clearly. I think you are asking about the copper factor. To what extent we're dependent on copper.
Absolutely.
Copper accounts for about 75% of our earnings. In fact, between 75 to 80% of our earnings as a country. In the past 2 years, there's been some level of structuring on how the mining companies pay their royalties and taxes to the Zambian government. And it means that they can no longer pay in the local currency, the kwacha. They are now paying in the US dollars, trying to boost the reserves and help the exchange rate, though it hasn't really worked the way we anticipated because the debt factor is so high at the moment. But in a nutshell, yes, as a country, we have depended so much for many years, in fact, since independence, on copper earnings to boost our economy.
Well, again, I don't know if Trevor is back. If you, yes, good to see that you're back, Trevor. Apologies for that, glitch to that connection to you. Perhaps we should throw this in and also allow you to finish your train of thoughts on that. Now, a lot of people have been asking how, your country got into the position it is at the moment. I'll let you finish up and weigh in onto that particular question. How did Zambia get to where it is at the moment in terms of its debt profile?
I think in terms of debt profile, this is a general challenge that we have on the African continent, because for Zambia, we got into the debt position because the country contracted debt at a rate higher than it can sustain. And this was faster than the growth of the GDP, as well as the capacity of the country to repay. But this was boosted, obviously, by the fact that Zambia's position after the HIPPI completion point in 2008 was changed from a low-income country to a middle-income country, which gave it leverage to be able to acquire commercial debt on the international market. Now, for most African countries that have been acquiring commercial debt, which is the Eurobonds, this has been driven by the fact that the funds they're able to get from the capital market do not come with oversight. So they can spend these resources as they wish without having to be able to provide transparency and accountability to any third parties, which was slightly different prior to the multilateral financing that was coming into the country. And this has driven most African countries to be able to continue to borrow funds as long as they are able to get the funds from the capital market. And this is a key consideration. And this has driven a lot of countries to be able to look at issues that come into play around corruption and overpricing of infrastructure that they actually invest in this, because they are able to get these funds without having to get oversight on them.
And now let's stretch it to other African countries. Now we already have been able to get a sense of what this is in Zambia. And again, quite a peculiar one, you would agree, for other African countries, Chibamba. So what do you think is the reason why many African nations are in heavy debts?
Well, the first factor Trevor has alluded to in the fact that if you look at what happens from 2012, 2013, there was this available commercial debt to Africa, the Eurobonds, and most of them really thought of accessing it without understanding why they needed the money. We have examples of some countries that actually borrowed the money without knowing what they wanted the money for, and accounting for that money being very difficult. So that's one factor, and Trevor talked about it. The other one is the temptation coming from the China. And China accounts for the bulk of debt stress in Africa at the moment. If you look at countries like Angola, Kenya, Zambia itself, Democratic Republic of the Congo, to a smaller extent, Nigeria, where you are, Mozambique, and others that are in debt stress, much of that is because of China. Now, China debt is structured in a way that supports the ambitions of African leaders, by and large, because it is focused on infrastructural investments. Now, infrastructures in telecoms, infrastructure in road networks, infrastructure in hospitals, and so forth. And much of it was contracted without proper alignment of national budgets. You know that planning is a key thing for any government. Planning ahead, national development plans are able to help government with their budgetary needs, so that debt itself must be planned for. Chinese debt, by and large, was not planned for. And I'll give you examples of some countries where individual ministers were able to access this debt and sign for some kind of infrastructure development without the approval of the Minister of Finance, because this is the one who is the custodian of the Treasury. And we had cases where when the Chinese realized that they contracted offered debt positions to individual countries without appropriate signatories, they had to come back again to sign. So you find the debt profile that sits with the Treasury was not consistent with the actual debt profile by different Chinese companies to these respective countries. And that's why it took longer, much longer for some countries to reconcile the debt positions. You find one number is announced, is 5 billion, another number is announced about 10 billion. Where is the mismatch here? It's just because there was no communication, no information, no proper debt profiling among these countries. So many of them now are in debt stress, and they realize Angola, which is really in debt stress, I think is the first country in Africa now to really face the highest level of debt in terms of GDP, is feeling it because they have done the reconciliations and they realize that, yes, they borrowed it for infrastructure, but much of that infrastructure, unfortunately, was overpriced. And number two, like Trevor said, for the Eurobonds, the interest rates are dependent on the credit rating agencies, and we are paying far, far higher than other borrowers in developed countries.
I'll come back to you, Chibamba, so that you can, weigh in on some bit of, IMF policy, since you once worked there. But quickly here, Trevor, listening to Chibamba, what readily comes to mind? I'm quite sure a lot of Nigerians will understand some of the key things he just explained, because Nigerians at the point were asking the Minister of Transportation to explain in clear terms the Chinese loan that is meant for, the rail infrastructure in the country at the moment. But again, for experts like yourself, Trevor, what should people, like yourself, be telling Africans, African countries, in terms of how to go about borrowing, these loans? Listening to Chibamba, he said something which you also alluded to. Sometimes these monies are, taken without clear-cut decision on what to use such loans for.
The first aspect around having to borrow is that obviously you have determined your capacity to be able to repay, and that the resources that are being borrowed are being utilized to be able to generate revenue to allow you to be able to pay. You cannot take all the resources and put them into social spending and expect that you'll be able to pay. So I think that is key for most of the African countries. But the second aspect is obviously their capacity to be able to repay these resources. We have had this tendency where the African countries have continued to borrow without any consideration as to how this is going to affect their fiscal position. We've got very basic measures that we use in terms of determining what is sustainable. And the general measure under the Monetary Union of the African Protocol Standard is 60% of GDP. Most of these African countries have all exceeded this. If you're looking at Angola, it's 120%. If you're looking at Ethiopia, Kenya, Angola, Mozambique, they have all exceeded the 100% of GDP in terms of what they have borrowed. So they have violated very basic principles of fiscal management. And the second aspect obviously speaks to the issues of good governance. One of the driving factors that allows these countries to be able to do this is the self-interest of our leaders, who continue to want to borrow without any consideration as to what is in the best interest of the countries. Otherwise, they would not continue to borrow this if they knew with the detriment that this is going to bring to the future economic development of the country. But they are looking at their personal immediate gains, and that's why they continue to borrow. If you look at the funds that are coming from the Chinese, there are three issues that come into play. The first one is that there has always been an issue about kickbacks, which come from the Chinese. Under their own Chinese law, they will not be able to give any kickbacks, but they do this through SOEs, state-owned enterprises, who are actually issuing out these loans. And then there's also the lack of transparency about the type of debt that we're getting from the Chinese, and whether it is long-term, whether it's concessional, what interest rates we're actually paying. And obviously, there are a couple of things that are undefined around collateral, that they want to be able to put these into specific projects which they can hold as collateral in case that the country actually defaults. We've had a specific history around this, that it has happened that China has taken over a port somewhere because the country defaulted. And this is very key in terms of the transparency that comes around with the Chinese debt.
Trevor, I think we'll come back to the patient more on that, because it will interest a lot of people. That has always been the fear of most Africans, especially in Nigeria, talking about the takeover and how that can also be tied to national security. And also you made mention of good governance, which is very key here. Let me come back to Chibamba. You once worked with the IMF. What informs the decision to lend a nation money or grant a relief to a nation that is already in debt?
Yeah, first of all, IMF has got very stringent measures in what we call conditionalities. I mean, it's really known as conditionalities. IMF money, if you may want to know, is not free money. It's money that has to be paid back, except that there is one, the tenor is not related to what Africa is looking for. Our IMF will not lend you beyond 3 years. So tenor is really about 3 years or less. And contrary to expectations of most African countries, the IMF will not give you the money you're looking for. Actually, they will not give you the money you're looking for, except for countries facing some geopolitical challenges like Egypt. Egypt can access as far in the margins of 14 billion US dollars. They have done that before. But for the much of Africa, IMF will simply help realign your profile as a debtor country. We are not looking at IMF as a savior in terms of the resources or the amount of money they give you. That's why here in Africa, they basically give you about 700 million US dollars, 350 million US dollars, far less than the debt position that you are in. The only good thing, of course, is that most of the creditors, especially the non-Chinese creditors, these are commercial creditors, will kind of relax a little bit based on you following an IMF program. And the issue about IMF lending is not so much in the money they gave you, it's in the credibility that creditors have about your country, the credit rating that your country begins to enjoy. And for most of the bilateral creditors, these are country-to-country creditors, they easily write off such debt because they now know you are being disciplined. There is a saying that once you are on an IMF program, your Minister of Finance cedes the right to govern. The Minister of Finance is now in Washington, D.C., and that is what we used to call at the IMF when I was there. So in a nutshell, IMF willing to help Africa, but debt position itself has reached levels of unsustainability to the level where the IMF itself is not so sure whether it will get its money back. The last example which IMF is using now is Ghana. Ghana got a loan from IMF. I was still there in Washington. And in 2015, Ghana did what was not agreed. They printed money without, which we call borrowing. Government borrowed money without permission from the IMF. And civil society organizations blew the whistle. We got information, and the Ghanaian Prime Minister came to Washington to apologize. In a nutshell, IMF is ready to support Africa come out of its debt, but it is the conditionalities that go with that particular funding or support that most African countries are not so sure of and they may not accept.
Let me bring in Trevor here. And the interesting perspective is to continue where Chibamda left off, and it's about the conditionalities. You made mention of, the clarity or otherwise, of the Chinese loans, which many Africans are still asking that, look, is shrouded somehow in some kind of mystery, something not too clear for the ordinary African to, understand. And again, the fears nursed by many has to do with the takeover of some of these infrastructure should there be any kind of default. Now, how can experts, like yourself, because it's so glaring, but again, some countries may not also know that that loan should be serviced because of the caveat tied to that loan. How can African countries not fall into that, should I call it a trap? It looks like a trap. But how can they escape that and not cede some of their national key assets to external, lenders?
Suleimani, that issue comes with good governance. The first aspect about having to be able to acquire debt is that there must be transparency about the type of debt that the country is contracting. And the conditionalities that come with the debt then will specifically speak to the interest of the country. And when you do that, if you find clauses that are speaking to you having to lose your sovereignty because of the debt that you need to acquire, then you can decide whether you actually want to do this. The challenge that we have is that we've got African leaders who do not have the best interest of the country and will sign the contract irrespective of how much of the country's sovereignty we are giving away. If you look at the specific infrastructure developments that China has been financing, they are speaking to the ones that we had here in Zambia, speaking to the hydropower generation that we're actually building at the moment for around $2.4 billion. That is being financed by the Chinese. We've also had a $293 million infrastructure that was transitioning us from analog to digital. This is also being done by the Chinese. We've got our national airport that is being constructed by the Chinese for $400 million. All these key infrastructures are speaking to issues that speak on state security. And yet we have allowed the Chinese to be able to finance them as well as design these projects. So the key issue here comes around to political will, that we must have the right kind of governance that speaks to the best interest of the country. And this has been lacking.
Well, Chibamba, just before the fall of Libya, if that's a better way to put it, time was when some people looked towards some other African countries like Libya and a few others who could actually lend other African countries. Perhaps listening to Trevor, the fear here is that if you had people who come in to design and build, and also somehow if you default, operate some key national assets, it would mean not only, colonialism in another form, but more or less like taking Africa and Africans back into where they're coming out from. So how can African countries get debt reliefs from private creditors, if possible at all?
In terms of commercial creditors, that is nearly impossible. Let the people get a true picture of what really happens with bond money, because we deal with the bond holders. That's part of my business anyway, and we deal with them every time. Bond holders are individuals in the real sense. These are pensioners. These are investors, individual families, workers. Some of them are in employment and passing on this money for fund management. and these fund managers, mutual funds, how to find lucrative areas of higher return. They've got a projection. No, they want maturity at a projected level. So this is not money by country. This is not money by UK or England. This is money that belongs to individual workers in respective countries, wherever they could be. And it's invested in Eurobond. And that's why any sign of default, people panic a lot. And the people they want to know from their managers, fund managers, this country is about to default. What happens to my money? They're worried. They get anxious. So this is the money you can never talk about in terms of forgiveness. You can just restructure it. And even when you restructure to pay moratorium or whatever you want to do, you want to pay in the future, even when you pay in the future, it still comes with a cost. It has to be agreed at a new interest rate. You cannot just say, we restructure now, we are not able to pay you, we'll only pay you, give us another 3 years. They will agree another 3 years, but at a higher price. In fact, even the restructuring process, you have to pay a fee. And so this is where the difficult issues are. And so most African countries are turning to China, and many of them are now arguing to China, saying, look, number one, you get us this debt without proper agreements, number one. Number two, you are the beneficiary. You ask for counterpart funding, which you are not able to put in. You are building our airports, you are building our railways, you are building our infrastructure, our roads. The maturity for these investments, for us to get back the money from those investments, is longer than when we are supposed to be paying you back. And three, the companies constructing this infrastructure are actually coming from China, using Chinese materials by and large. So you are already benefiting, and you are ring-fencing the incomes already from these investments. What more? So the only possible avenue for restructuring is China, to me. And African governments must come together and say, China, you are the major creditor to us through infrastructure. You are already benefiting from the infrastructure, and you've got the best leeway to restructure this debt and forgive us. And China has kind of been coming forth. Remember, it's not Chinese government by and large, it's also Chinese companies, but Chinese government can take over that debt from the Chinese companies, commercial creditors, and maybe that is the only avenue for restructuring, not from commercial debt.
We'll take a moment. We'll come back to Trevor and Chibamba. We'll talk more about, some of these key issues, and more so some of the fears of some Africans if Africa is going through another round of colonialism, and this time from the Far East. Welcome back. It's our home stretch here on Village Square Africa on News Central Television, and we're looking at Africa's debt profile and how Africa can actually wriggle out of, this quagmire. As of December 2020, almost 20% of the countries that were offered a debt relief also rejected it owing to fears over their credit ratings. Now, This leaves these countries in a very tough corner as their credit ratings slump over failure to meet up with debt repayments. Debts keep rising due to cost of servicing and resources. They're continuously, tanking. But of the 38 countries due for the G20 suspension relief in Africa, wait for this, 31 have requested a form of relief. Now, China has also written off arrears on interest-free loans, but this makes up less than 5% of its total lending to Africa. Bondholders, who make up 19% of debts owed by African countries, have refused to grant relief. The combined effects of these debt burdens in Africa are disastrous to the development of the continent. Debt reliefs hardly relieve the continent, but they grant a brief reprieve until the next trouble. So we'll still have our analyst here, Trevor Hambai, and Chibamba Kenyama with us here. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Now, let's see how we can close up on this conversation. Now, let me go to you, Trevor. Listening to Chibamba before we went on that break, a whole lot has been going through the mind of some of the Africans watching, sending messages, and they're worried, they're sharing my own worry, about colonialism, the fear that we just might wake up and see that some countries are being run by non-Africans. So do you think it's right that African countries in debt get relief again? Recall that Nigeria once got that from the Paris Club.
Sorry, Suleimani, I was saying as Africans, we shouldn't be in this position. The first thing that you must appreciate is that the African continent holds a very strategic position in terms of the future geopolitical position for the future. We have, as an African continent, most of the natural resources are on the African continent in terms of whether it's minerals, whether it's gas, whether it's oil. All those are on the African continent. And what you do see from the global space is that the trade war is not about the trade war. It is about global domination. And the Chinese have strategized their positioning to be able to dominate the African continent from a future perspective, because all the natural resources that are going to be driving global growth, or whether you're looking at the fourth industrial revolution, are all on the African continent. The other aspect that we do have in strength on the African continent is population, that we've got 60% of the population on the African continent is below 25. So it guarantees a lot of potential for the future. And this is a driving factor that the African continent should not be in a position to be seeking for financing from the West. We needed to be strategizing our positioning to be able to use the natural resources that we have to better the continent. And this must be taking us to an industrial revolution to be able to produce, to manufacture, to process our raw materials into finished goods to export to the Western world. But we are exporting raw materials and losing all the money that we make by having to buy the finished products that we buy from the industrialized world. And this is key in terms of our borrowing. But the second aspect outside that is obviously governance, that we need to have governments that have got the country's interest at heart to ensure that they are not borrowing beyond the capacity of the countries to repay. And those two aspects are key in terms of where the African continent is going to be in the next 30 years.
I think you just raised a very important point here. Keep in mind, it was only recently Ghana did try to see the kind of reversal they can do in terms of cocoa, taking all of this. And at the end of the day, every African would want to go for the Swiss chocolate when in actual fact, as you highlighted, the raw materials are from Africa. Nigeria is not, immune from all of that, taking crude oil to be refined outside the continent, and the derivatives are not even brought back to the continent. Now, Chibamba, help us here now, because he said something quite unique, and a lot of Africans are asking, If we have great minds like yourselves and even some others in government, as highlighted by Trevor, he said something about good governance. How can we start talking about some of the key things and also effecting them so that Africa, with its population, with its young population, with its natural and human potential, can actually be the next destination point for every other part of the world?
The major challenge, I would say, first of all, is the rent-seeking behavior that you find in Africa. And my view is that Africa is a victim of itself. We know that the global marketing system is rigged in favor of the developed countries. They own the capital, they own the markets, they basically run the financial systems. They are well coordinated, collaborated, and they know what they're looking for. And Trevor is talking about the fourth industrial revolution. It's anchored on Africa, but we haven't had as a strong foresight. We haven't had that strong foresight as a continent to anticipate that future and lock into that future now. And largely because of self-interest, the rent-seeking behavior, the desire to survive now. Look at exploration activities. Just basic exploring to tap into the natural resources which we export to raw. Who is exploring? Go into any African country right now. Go to Tanzania, go to even Zambia here, go to Congo DR, any country where there is massive exploration for minerals, massive exploration for oil. Who is exploring? If we cannot just do the basic to explore and tap that natural resources, how can we properly galvanize our exports and control and be a key player in the global market system? We are borrowing money to tap into the natural resources, which is done by the same person we're complaining about. They're the ones who are tapping into that. It's only when they have tapped into the natural resources, put the infrastructure, and then we want to nationalize and take over. I don't think it works like that. It's a system that must begin to say, if we have to control the natural resources, we must have sufficient capacity to tap into it ourselves. Of course, working with them, working with whoever on win-win arrangements, and then arranging for actual processing in country. Unfortunately, like I said earlier on, it's about governance, it's about rent-seeking behavior, it's about lack of foresight and anticipation. We have our educated people who are not working to their home countries. The same resources we are abandoning here is being tapped into across the line into Europe and being highly productive. We can't tap into that. What are some of the lessons we can learn from countries like Rwanda? I'm not very familiar with the Rwanda story, but I'll tell you something: discipline. And I'll summarize my response when I say discipline with one true story. And it may look and appear very, very insignificant, but it tells you about the power of discipline in arresting the outflow of resources at low value. I was at the IMF. There was a conference there, and Commissioner of Taxes, that was the year back, Commissioner of Taxes, the Commissioner of Taxes, Commissioner General, and a Rwandese Commissioner of Taxes. And I was asking the Zambian, when are you going back? He says, I came here last week, and I'm going here. I still have to do something for another 1 week. That was after the conference. I was with the Rwandese guy from Rwanda. I said, when are you going back? He says, I'm flying in tonight. I flew in yesterday, and I'm flying in tonight. The president of Rwanda will not allow me for Kagame because there's a rule. Any government official going out for a conference out of the country must catch the last flight leaving the country to the conference to be in time for the conference, and must catch the first flight coming back to Rwanda after the conference. This is about management of resources. This is about leadership. This is about foresight. This is about good corporate governance, good national governance. And once we get into that, I don't think Africa would be in a position it is in today. Thank you.
Well, I think this perspective or this example you just given resonates with a lot of Africans, and we've seen how much this plays out in a lot of African countries. Trevor, well, it sounds as if this is something unique about many countries, but looking at what he's talked about Paul Kagame and his cabinet, now it comes back to what you highlighted earlier on, good governance and of course a foresight to achieving some of these key things. Now, should African countries, be looking to, invest more, in some of these key, natural resources you talked about? Chibambe asked a big question. Of all those who are taking some of these things out of Africa, tell me which one of them is an African? So even when we talk about the countries, the companies, these are not even companies owned by Africans. So can the ECOWAS for the West African region and also for the East African region, or looking at the AU, because if you look at the AU, one of the key things, again, is also how to fix some of these things you both have highlighted. Is the AU, as it is presently constituted, working its talk?
Unfortunately, I do not think so. I think the important aspect that I see with AU is obviously they have worked towards having to put together the strategy that the African continent should have, and that is embedded in the Agenda 2063. But in between here, we've had, as an African continent, adopted policies that have been designed by the West, which have come through the United Nations in the MDGs as well as the SDGs that are currently running. The African continent needs to be able to define this. The AU has got an agenda, but I don't think they have put the resources that are going to be speaking to this. And the second aspect, once we have put the resources together that are speaking to us achieving Agenda 2063, is do we have the governance that can implement this? The African continent has got a very big challenge in implementation. We know what the challenge is. We know what the solution is. The problem comes when we start to speak about implementation. And I think that is what Chibambe is alluding to the fact that we know that we need to be able to own these resources that we want to explore, but we have not put the strategies that will ensure that this is done by Africans. One of the things that you see in terms of the African continent is that 90% of the entire business space, which is the private sector, are SMEs. And this constitutes the largest portion of the private sector on the African continent. For them to be able to achieve success and contribute to economic development is that we need to have a strategy as to how do we bring these mostly informal and formal SMEs into the playing platform to invest into large businesses. And that is the key. We do find a lot of disadvantages in the aspect that the ones who can access these assets are foreign entities because they are given a lot of incentives in foreign direct investors. And I think those are the issues that we need to be able to look at. But it all will have to start from the governance position before we are able to bring in the private sector.
Let's see if we can close on this one question that I want both of you to attempt, solutions. Let me start with Chibambe. And what's the solution to reducing these debts and the propensity to borrow in the future?
For me, the first one is how to seal the leakages. It still takes us back to the need for good governance and high levels of accountability by those that are entrusted with power. Africa Africa, if you look at most African countries, they actually have systems and policies. You'll be surprised. They have systems and policies. They have laws that help to govern these countries and help to govern the management of resources. Financial management systems are there. Parliament has put those laws together. But it can only take one person to disobey these rules that we put together. The man you are showing right now has shown a high level of commitment. That laws are not there for celebration. Laws are there to help you govern, not only political governance, but economic governance as well. So for me, the only way to come out of this state is discipline. Discipline, and to let us negotiate with knowledge. Let us negotiate to reposition these African countries, restructure these states. We know that we're dependent on natural resources, the copper, the diamond, whatever, which commodities whose prices fluctuate from time to time. The best thing is let us learn to have focus on maintaining a healthy reserve from whatever we earn and focus on the benefits these reserves will have on the future generation. And once we do that with greater levels of accountability, I'm sure that we shall harness all the resources, including intellectual capital, to help us come out of this doldrum. Thank you.
And for you, Trevor?
I think Chibamba has summarized what the solutions are. But in addition to this, basically, firstly is obviously the political will that we should have in every African continent, which is going to be speaking to the best interest of the country. The second one is obviously fiscal management in terms of the discipline, how we manage our country's resources. This is very, very important in terms of us having to create sustainable economic growth. And then we must be driving, obviously, the long-term sustainable economic strategies that are going to be speaking, obviously, covering the issues around export diversification. We've got too many African countries that are single commodity dependent, whether it's just oil or it's copper or it's diamonds. We need to be able to diversify from this. And this is speaking to us having to utilize the raw materials that we're creating. But the strength of the African continent is that we must start to be able to create employment for the large youth that we have that are below 25. And this is what is going to deliver the economic growth of the continent. I think those are my key considerations as a solution for the future.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for being such a nice company, Trevor Hambai and Chibamba Kayama. Many thanks. You know, the talk on Africa's debt isn't ending yet as we seek solutions to this problem that threatens Africa's development. Will a write-off of Africa's debts be a profound solution to the problems and prevent future crises? That's the big question a lot of people are asking. And listen to both of you, I dare say, well, the answers have been so given. We're hoping that countries on the continent will have the audacity to, get busy. And of course, especially for our political leaders, get busy and do the needful. Many thanks again, Trevor and Chibamba. I'm Sulaiman Aled. Tomorrow again, we'll continue the conversation here on The Square. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.